All right, kids, let's talk a little bit about what Richard Hart responded to the SEC with. The SEC, if you remember, in July, sent a demand for a jury trial to Richard Hart, naming Richard Hart, PulseX, and PulseChain as individuals in the demand for civil trial. Now, they named all three of them, not just Richard Hart, but the two products, PulseX and PulseChain, because he doesn't have entities for either of those, and they're tying him to those. Even though the software programs, they're alleging that he's responsible for their creation and direction. So that's where that comes from. Well, that was filed. He had all this time to get a response in a motion to dismiss, which he did through some very expensive, very experienced lawyers. He hired the best ones, former SEC guys, former prosecutors. They're qualified people, and he didn't skimp on that. Of course, with all the money he's got from investors, why would he? So they put together what is probably the best motion to dismiss that anybody could, and now that's been submitted. Now, the court does not have an obligation to get back to them tomorrow on this. I'll show you a little later the schedule as to how these things are going to come out. But they're going to review this. It was sent in on the 8th, and now it's the 11th. I have a few thoughts on it. I think his past statements are probably going to sink his ship no matter what. There's been so much evidence out there, and people sometimes wonder, why does the SEC wait before they do anything? Why don't they submit a little faster? What's going on? Part of what they're doing is collecting evidence. So all this time, they've been just gathering up evidence and putting things together, and it doesn't have to all be in that demand for jury trial. They could just be holding back some cards they don't need to display just yet, and then we're going to see them come out. Even on these like PulseChain, PulseX, Hex, all that is being investigated, all as one, along with Richard Hart. Some of the language that he used, I think this is what's going to prove out to be interesting. I made a little note here. Creative language, okay, sacrifice and all that, and charity, and not a real investment, and we don't know who the OA is, the origin address. And I think the part that's going to kill him, though, is this misappropriation of funds, because now this could turn into a criminal case if they successfully allege this, because the SEC is not the only one doing this. They're doing the work right now, but the DOJ, you can be sure they are watching it all unfold. And if it goes through with a successful civil suit, they'll have a nice big stack of what can be called evidence, and they can walk right in and put the cuffs on Richard Hart and charge him criminally. Will they do that? Will they not? We'll see, but I'm just saying that this use of term misappropriation of funds showing up in the complaint is a major red flag. I think that's going to come back to haunt him. Now, this was the original document. You can look at that, the complaint that the SEC submitted. It's 26 pages. July 31st, it was sent in, or 27 pages. It doesn't have to show everything. It doesn't have to prove anything here. It just has to be enough that there could be a case for the federal government. So the argument in a motion to dismiss would be that this doesn't even come close. It's completely off base, and just get it out of here, baseless. And that's under something called a 12b6 in the Federal Rules for Civil Procedure, a failure to make a claim upon which relief can be granted. So that is the basis for this very long motion to dismiss, which I've been sort of poking through. I didn't read every last thing in here, but you can check it out yourself. He put a copy on Twitter, which I can show you where to get that later. But it is Richard Schuler, Hex, PulseChain, PulseX, Securities Commission, and his 11 lawyers that put this all together. And you can just see some of the headlines here, the parties and the arguments. The court lacks personal jurisdiction. They're trying to say that he lives over in Europe, and therefore he wasn't availing himself of the market here. So there's no reason that he should be charged in a U.S. court. SEC fails to plead the existence of a domestic purchase, sale, or offer of securities. Okay, they're all going to say that. Complaint fails to state a claim upon which, for securities fraud here. Complaint does not adequately allege that any parties entered into an investment contract. The complaint unconstitutionally infringes on the First Amendment rights. This one's a stretch. I'm sorry. Your First Amendment, if you've done all these things here, that doesn't stop them from gathering evidence for a crime, but whatever, they threw it in there anyway. So this is worth a look. In my opinion, they're doing the best they can do with a turd, and they're going to polish it. But some of these things, like lack of personal jurisdiction, that's not going to take much. He's a U.S. citizen. I'm not to say that he automatically is covered by the SEC, but the long arm of the law gets to reach things when it comes to financial, making use of the financial networks, transmitting funds. They probably have jurisdiction over him just for that. Never mind the fact that Uniswap was used until not long after this was filed. I think August 2023, they stopped processing hex on their decks. Hex on their decks. Anyway, they stopped selling at or allowing transactions of that once this complaint went through, because Uniswap is, well, partially based in Brooklyn. They have a couple of developers up there, and there was at least one case of a transaction involving hex from a resident of Brooklyn. That's all it takes is one transaction like that of a U.S. resident. And they're trying to make this argument that, well, no, they didn't offer these securities to Americans, and you're using YouTube. You're talking about dollars. You're speaking in English. You have mostly Americans watching it, and I know not exclusively. So I don't think they're going to be able to escape the idea that he's purposely availing himself to the American market, which is the largest crypto market on the planet in terms of retail. So a lot of these things are grasps at straws, but I guess I can't blame them for grasping. Fails to state a claim for securities fraud, alleges no deceptive act or fraudulent scheme. Now again, the bar for a federal complaint to be taken seriously by the courts isn't that high. They have to come in there with something, and I think just by reading the document that they submitted, the SEC, they've got enough to get the ball rolling. So they made a good effort here. There is going to be a response to it. During this, I was looking up and I found out, this is the article that pointed it out, Richard Hart claims SEC lawsuit infringes on his free speech. They take the most specious claim and put that as a headline. It's probably not fair. There's better arguments in that document. But it did cover something I hadn't heard of before from a lawyer named Siebert, who was I didn't know this, back in 2019. He did a podcast on YouTube himself and Tone Vays and one other guy, just discussing this offering of hex, and the things that Richard Hart said. Siebert was saying that he had enough right there to, if he were looking to prosecute, to nail him on creating a security. I mean, but he just charged ahead with it anyway. He kept promoting it for years, doubled down afterwards, got PulseChain, PulseX. So, and who is this guy? Well, Jason Siebert, here's what he said. When he asked him point blank who's behind the origin address, he said he wasn't going to say and would never say because he didn't want to run afoul of the Howey test. To me, that was prima facie evidence of an unregistered offering on nearly day one, basically admitted to a violation on day one. Just by saying that he doesn't want to respond to who's the origin address, well, I guess I'm not quite sure if he's suggesting that Richard Hart knows who's the origin address, and by saying who that is, he'd violate the Howey test. How would he violate the Howey test if it wasn't him, if he had nothing to do with it? That's a little weird, I got to admit. So that was one thing they brought up. And there's the other thing here, Discovery, can talk about this too. The DOJ, as I mentioned before, is happy to let the SEC do discovery, do their work, get something first on the civil side, which then creates the basis for a possible arrest warrant in the future. Exactly. It's going to put it on autopilot. Once they nail him on the civil side, the DOJ walks in with the cuffs and applies them. So he could be looking at a felony charge against Hart. Well, Hart could be looking at that. Now, who is this Jason Siebert guy? He's pretty experienced. He actually was defending at one point a guy behind the first Bitcoin $4.5 million Ponzi scheme, Trendon Shavers. This is back in 2014. Okay, the SEC and the financial world generally didn't know a whole hell of a lot about crypto back in 2014. Jason Siebert was representing him. He defended Shavers for a short period of time during the SEC civil action, spoke about the case Tuesday, Inside Bitcoins. He thought Shavers was a scapegoat for the agency. That's probably true, because they couldn't catch Bernie Madoff. So the SEC does consider optics. But this guy went a little too far. And I see some parallels between Trendon Shavers' case. And again, originally, SEC charges Bitcoin entrepreneur with offering unregistered securities. This is June 2014. This sounds similar to what they could charge what they allege already with Richard Hart. And later on, it turned criminal. But let's just talk a little bit. We'll cover a little bit what this guy, Jason Siebert, said. Listen to this little bit right here.
Slipped up.
Oh, he did. He did the 10,000x comparison to Bitcoin. It was on the
$1 million. Yeah. So in our first of all, in our 7-hour grilling, when Richard Hart came on, first thing I did.
This was the podcast that they had. It was Tone Vays and Jason Siebert here that talked about this back in 2019. I didn't go to find that because it's actually pretty damn long, but these guys did a more recent one here, and 8 months ago it looks like, and they just covered the parts that matter This is actually before this motion to dismiss came out.
And I'm paraphrasing here, is advise him not to speak. I just want to make that clear. And he said, "You've Mirandized me."
Richard Hart being a smartass, you're reading my Miranda rights because, whatever. Now I guess I'm a criminal defendant. I don't know what he was trying to prove with that, but whatever.
His words. And then he went on for 6 hours talking about how great everything was, how the tokenomics of Hex are better than Bitcoin and better than Ethereum. He went on to describe the intricate workings of all of it. And all I had to do was sit there and play the role of taking a deposition. And that's what I did.
Sometimes you just let egos talk.
I played stupid. I played smart. I played angry. I played frustrated. I just let him talk. And the guy hung himself. He just hung himself. Everything.
Well, yeah.
When he said, I'm not going
Jason,
to, this is the thing.
One of the things he did, well, let him continue, see if he says it.
When he said, I am not going to tell you who has control or the keys to that wallet because I don't want you to know, because you'll get it in your head, in your idiot head, that somehow I'm the guy that you sue, or whoever that is that you sue as part of the Howey test. So he specifically said, I am not going to tell you who holds those keys, which is a material omission in connection with the sale of a security. I mean, everything the SEC needs is right there. It's just.
So if he knows who the origin address is and said, I'm not going to tell you, that's a lot different than what he was saying in videos. Oh, the origin, no one knows who the origin address is. No. People know, it's on record. So discovery will proceed. You'll be deposed and we'll all find out who the origin address is. Now, something that he didn't talk about here, one of the things that's getting Richard Hart in trouble is the fact that he called it a CD. Well, a CD, unless it's a CD sold by a local bank, the CDs offered by brokerages are actually securities. So if you're using language like, oh, it's a CD, it pays interest. Well, if you're going to start pretending to be a CD and you're not pretending to be a bank, that starts to sound like you're offering a CD which brokerage houses offer. So they'll use that against him. The idea of, you can earn interest on your HEX and lock it up. Well, guess what screwed over the guy in the Bitcoin Ponzi that we talked about earlier? Yeah. He actually pleaded guilty to securities fraud. And he's facing he faced up to 20 years. He was sentenced since this writing. So it went from a civil case right into DOJ for Trendon, what's his name again? Trendon Shavers. Yeah. In 2014, ultimately found to be engaging in a Ponzi scheme where money from new investors was used to issue interest payments to new investors. He exchanged Bitcoin from US dollars to pay personal expenses. Well, exchanging HEX into US dollars to fund your lifestyle comes kind of close to that. And interest payments, okay, this sounds a little bit like the whole ethos behind HEX, PulseX, PulseChain, whatever else that Richard Hart has been talking about. So yeah, this guy was sentenced for operating a Bitcoin Ponzi scheme. And it makes it a Ponzi because if you're taking money from new people coming in and using that to pay out other people, he didn't do it quite the same way. But what Richard Hart looked like he's done, there's most of the Ethereum transactions, allegedly, that took place involved repurchases. And there were things that Richard Hart was doing himself to make it look like there was more action on the HEX side. He would move this money around, buy tokens, buy securities, and it's creating an artificial action idea so that people new to the whole ecosystem come in, they see all the trading going on, they hear about the hype, and they want to participate. It's a little bit like matched orders, which is illegal in the stock market, where you might have your buddy, he makes a bid on something and you make a bid on it, and then you go back and forth like this, and that pretends it artificially creates an environment that doesn't exist, and it is trying to get bystanders to participate in the market by creating matched orders. Well, they didn't use that language specifically here, but you get the idea. Shavers was paying quote-unquote interest in his scheme, and Richard Hart is manipulating money to pay interest in his. And by the way, this guy here, Gerber Goral, he is the director of enforcement in the SEC. So it's not always Gary Gensler that's initiating this. This guy operates independently from Gary Gensler, and he knows even less about crypto. So he's definitely the one who initiated the move against Richard Hart. And like I said, there's more to come. This poster here, Hexagon Hill on Twitter, detailed April 8th is when the motion to dismiss was filed. And April 11th, that's today, initial scheduling conference. Okay, so they scheduled, big deal. I didn't bother tuning into that. April 15th, you'll see motions for leave to file for amicus brief. That's friend of the court. I'm not sure how much that's really going to help him, but you can have legal experts file on your behalf, and vice versa. I suppose the government can do that too. July 8th. Okay, July 8th, the SEC responds to the motion to dismiss. So it's now April 11th, July 8th. That's a long time, and there's still, the clock is running. It doesn't stop because we submitted a brief. We don't wait until the SEC responds. They can still conduct discovery. So July 8th, and then after July 8th, then Richard Hart gets to file a reply brief to address the arguments made in the SEC's response, which could have even more evidence from all the discovery in it. Don't know. I assume they're going to use that. And then finally, October 24th, oral argument be held on Richard's motion to dismiss before the judge. The judge doesn't actually rule on this until way later. I mean, you can see how long this is going to take. And like I said, discovery happens, and you're not going to get a stay on discovery. Okay, more than likely, there's no rules for a stay. The Richard Hart's lawyers, I'm sure they're considering this, but they're not going to get it, where they basically appeal to the court to get the SEC to stop discovery until the ruling on the motion to dismiss comes out sometime in October, whatever. No, they're not going to get that. So what I'm trying to say is it doesn't look good for Richard Hart and his CD product, which is going to be considered a security. If you have money in Hex or Hex products, remember now, Uniswap won't let you get rid of it. So you've got to go through whatever DEX or bridge or whatever the hell you can to get rid of that. Otherwise, you might wind up like this guy here. Don't be like this guy. Don't be expecting a pump. Don't be expecting it to make your retirement fund. Just get the hell out while you can. Thanks for watching.